Some secrets don't fade with time, they simply grow quiet, tucked away behind old photographs, or buried beneath a well-rehearsed smile. But when those secrets begin to speak, it's not just the truth that surfaces, it's the unraveling of a carefully constructed lie. What you're about to hear isn't just a tale of murder, it's a haunting echo of human fear, silence, and the shadows we live beside. This is a truth long buried, and now it's ready to speak in its own voice. It was a bleak, windless morning in the secluded village of Elmridge Hollow, the kind of morning where even the birds chose silence and the chimneys puffed smoke as if exhaling grief. The sky hung low with a muted grayness that pressed down on cobbled streets and thatched roofs, giving the entire village the feel of a scene paused in solemn reflection. There was no breeze, no rustle of trees, just a stillness so absolute that even footsteps on gravel seemed like trespasses. The chapel bell rang once, a single mournful chime that summoned the villagers with the weight of finality. Clad in respectful shades of charcoal and navy, gloves on hands and expressions carefully composed, the locals filed into the time-worn chapel to bid farewell to Mr. Reginald Hargrave, a man whose presence had been like the ticking of a grandfather clock, reliable, predictable, and taken for granted until it stopped. Though his death came without scandal or violence, there was a strange sharpness in the air, as if everyone felt, without saying, that something about this funeral wasn't quite right. Miss Agatha Lorne took her seat in the very last pew, as was her custom in moments like these. It wasn't humility that drew her to the rear but wisdom. From the shadows one saw more than from the light. She watched the proceedings with calm detachment, her sharp, pale blue eyes flicking from one mourner to the next. She had encountered Reginald at summer fetes, winter fundraisers, and garden tours. He was always gracious, always polished, and yet Agatha had never trusted that quiet surface. Something in his eyes had always suggested the effort of keeping something submerged. As the vicar began his eulogy, extolling Reginald's contributions to the chapel ceiling's restoration and his quiet support of the village orphanage, Agatha studied the mourners. Celeste the niece sat rigid and pale, hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles whitened, her lips pressed into a line that spoke more of endurance than sorrow. To her right stood Benedict Hargrave, the long-absent brother, who had returned after decades spent in South America. His face was tanned but tired, carved with lines that might have been guilt or sun. He wore his grief like an ill-fitting jacket, visible but not convincing. The ceremony moved forward with all the expected grace, but just as the pallbearers stepped forward to close the casket, a ripple of unease swept the room. From the far end of the chapel, a figure emerged, tall, slender, moving with the fluid precision of someone who had not come to mourn, but to deliver something. Dressed entirely in black, with a wide-brimmed veil, concealing her face and a tailored grey coat that shimmered faintly with elegance, the woman drew every eye, except, strangely, no one acknowledged her. It was as though she had walked in cloaked not just in mourning but in invisibility. She stepped soundlessly to the side of the casket, reached into the sleeve of her coat, and withdrew a folded piece of paper. With a trembling gloved hand, she laid it gently atop Reginald's chest. Her fingers lingered, not with love, but with hesitation, perhaps regret. And then, just as quickly, she turned and returned to her seat, head bowed as though she had always been there. Only Miss Lorne had truly seen her, had noted the way her hands shook, not with sorrow but with nerves, the kind that follow a long-held secret finally released. Agatha said nothing. She never did. Instead she stored the image carefully, placing it beside dozens of others that had once seemed inconsequential, until they weren't. The rest of the funeral passed in traditional cadence, hymns echoing faintly, prayers murmured with obligatory reverence, and the slow procession to the graveyard where the coffin was lowered with the care of old rituals. Earth was sprinkled, goodbyes whispered, and still that folded note remained beneath the lid, a silent message tucked beneath a silence deeper than any sermon. But the village would not remain quiet for long. By dawn, as drizzle streaked the windows and mist clung to hedgerows, rumors began to swirl. Curtis Hale, the church caretaker, an irritable but reliable man, had been found unconscious near the fresh grave, babbling disjointed fragments no one could quite decipher. The doctor blamed stress, fatigue, perhaps a touch of whiskey, but the villagers were not so easily comforted. Curtis never missed breakfast, and more curiously, he had no reason to revisit the grave after the burial. And then there were the small details Agatha alone had noticed on her afternoon walk, details others would have stepped over without a second glance. The soil at the head of the grave looked subtly disturbed, not enough to cause alarm, but just enough to suggest that someone had knelt there, or tried to dig. And then there was the wreath, a single ghostly arrangement of white roses and baby's breath, placed neatly but anonymously. No name, no card, no memory attached. By evening, whispers turned into speculations. The grave had been disturbed. Nothing had been stolen, or so it seemed. But the truth, Agatha knew, was rarely ever found in what was missing. It was always hidden in what was left behind. And sometimes, what's buried doesn't stay that way. As the final hymn dissolved into the hollow echo of the church's ancient stone, and the last of the mourners shuffled away on softened footsteps, only Miss Eliza Harrow remained still, her gaze fixed on the casket as though trying to read what no eyes could see. She had caught it, a fleeting, deliberate motion cloaked in mourning black, a gloved hand, trembling just enough to betray intention, slipped a folded piece of paper into the open coffin moments before it was sealed forever. No one else saw, or perhaps no one dared acknowledge what had passed like a shadow across the silence. Now that paper was gone, entombed with Leonard Brabazon, no trace left behind, no whisper of explanation. But Eliza, seasoned by years of quiet watching and quieter thinking, knew better than to dismiss it as grief-stricken sentiment or morbid fancy. No, such gestures were rarely innocent. In her long study of human behavior, she had learned that guilt, true guilt, often seeks the dead when the living no longer offer sanctuary. And so, as she packed her knitting into a bag more useful than it appeared, and dressed herself for a casual visit to the vicar's wife, she did not go as a mourner, but as something far more observant, a patient listener in a village that did not yet realize it was whispering truths. The next morning, with clouds hanging pale and low, she returned to the churchyard, carrying a modest posy of rosemary and cornflowers, a symbol of remembrance wrapped in deliberate subtlety. There, resting among the professionally arranged bouquets, was a curious anomaly, a bunch of wild primrose, crudely tied with fraying twine, the kind of flowers a person picks in secret and places with trembling hands. This, to Eliza, was not merely a gesture of grief but a breadcrumb. She knelt seemingly to adjust her flowers, and committed every detail to memory: the fresh soil, the angle of the stone, the absence of a name on the card. Moments later, as though summoned by fate, Mrs. Penelope Thatch, the vicar's wife and the parish's most generous dispenser of carefully phrased gossip, approached, her voice dropping instinctively as she leaned in. "It's Godfrey, you see," she murmured, casting a glance toward the path. "He came back too suddenly. Walks the grounds like a man counting ghosts. Since Isabel vanished, well, none of us expected him to return." Eliza nodded, offering no interruption, only the occasional sound of understanding, encouraging more than questioning. She learned that one of the gravediggers had stumbled, mid-duty, and refused to finish, claiming the soil felt wrong beneath his spade, that it whispered. Most dismissed it, of course, as a touch of drink or village superstition, but Eliza filed it under something more sinister. That afternoon, she visited the vicar's study with the perfect pretense, the return of a rare devotional pamphlet. While the vicar rummaged in a drawer, she allowed her eyes to wander to the faded group photograph propped unobtrusively on a side shelf. It was an old image, unmistakably taken on the Brabazon estate, Leonard in his younger days, with a teenage Isabel beside him, and various household staff arranged in formal rows. But it was the far edge that caught her eye. The photograph had been cropped with unusual precision, not damaged or torn, but carefully altered. A woman's hand, delicate and feminine, still rested on a footman's shoulder, yet the rest of her body had been removed entirely from view, as though erased from memory. Eliza said nothing, but her mind locked onto the image like a thread on a needle, pulling tight. That evening, beneath a soft dusk and the scent of rain-soaked ivy, she paid a visit to Mrs. Dalrymple, the retired housekeeper, who had once run the Brabazon household with quiet authority. Over lukewarm tea and cooling scones, Eliza wove the conversation gently, circling around the past like a hawk gliding overhead. Was there ever unpleasantness? She asked lightly, watching Dalrymple's spoon pause mid-stir. The old woman hesitated, eyes narrowing. Not scandal, no, she said slowly. Nothing spoken aloud, but there was a woman Isabel's guest, charming, clever, always watching. She left one night, just gone, and no one dared mention her again. Outside, the wind stirred the hedgerows, and inside, Eliza felt the final piece of unease settle into place. She didn't yet know the woman's name, or why she had been cut from the photograph, but she knew with cold certainty that she was the one the paper in the coffin was meant for, or from. And so, as the fire crackled low, and shadows deepened in the corners of the room, Miss Eliza Harrow understood what no one else yet saw. This funeral had not closed a chapter, it had opened a wound, and the dead, buried with their secrets, were beginning to whisper. There was a peculiar stiffness in Mrs. Halbert's posture, as she placed her teacup down with a soft clink, eyes darting toward the lace-curtained window, as though half expecting the past to peer in. There was a girl, she murmured after a pause thick with unspoken dread. Clara. Yes, Clara Merrow. Quiet little thing, barely more than a shadow in the halls. Left suddenly, without so much as a farewell or a reference. Her voice faltered, the air around her heavy with things left unsaid. Across from her, Miss Eleanor Graves, composed yet calculating, leaned in ever so slightly, her mind already working through the implications like threads in a tapestry of secrets. Clara's abrupt departure had not been mentioned in years, not aloud anyway, but the silence around it had never quite settled. And it wasn't just her disappearance. It was the way Julian Edgewater left mere days later, bound for Alexandria, with no prior plan, no explanation, no farewell even to his sister. At the time, it had been chalked up to business, but those closest to the family, especially the staff, had whispered a different kind of story, one rooted in hushed quarrels, closed-door meetings, and the sudden death of Arthur Vale, the family butler, whose quiet loyalty had once been the backbone of the Edgewater household. That night, by the flicker of candlelight in her parlor, Miss Graves unearthed an old letter from her cousin Sarah, a governess, who had once served in Elmsley Row, and read it again with a sharpened eye. Margaret always seemed rehearsed, the letter said, kind with guests but brittle behind closed doors. Julian watched her like one watches a lit fuse, close, but never close enough. The implications, once subtle, now screamed. Determined to peel back the layers further, Miss Graves sought out Miss Agatha Lovelace, whose memories, though wrapped in velvet politeness, held a sharper truth beneath. Clara was afraid of something, Agatha confessed over tea. I once found her crying in the conservatory. She said she saw something, knew something, but couldn't tell anyone. Said no one would believe her. Margaret had scolded her earlier that day. Julian never said a word, just stood there, watching. As the wind howled against the shutters that evening, Miss Graves sat alone, digesting the puzzle with the patience of someone used to shadows. The next day, cloaked in a shawl and purpose, she visited the church archives under the innocent guise of searching for botanical notes for the vestry garden. But what she truly sought lay in the fragile parish logs. In the brittle pages yellowed by time, she found it. Clara Merrow, dismissed without reference, the note eerily succinct. Just beneath it, Julian Edgewater, steamer to Alexandria, booked with urgency. No reason given, no farewell banquet, just 2 exits, one silent, one shrouded in haste. But what chilled Miss Graves most was not the record of the past, it was the handwriting she recognized in the present. Earlier at the funeral of the family matriarch, a guest book had circulated, a routine formality. But Eleanor, ever watchful, had taken note of a name toward the bottom of the list, one written in a careful unfamiliar hand, but bearing a chilling familiarity. See Merrow, she hadn't died, she hadn't disappeared forever, she had returned, and her return, cloaked in mourning, was no accident. Clara had come back not to grieve, but to confront the silence, to unravel what had been concealed beneath decades of respectable decay. Someone in Elmsley Row had buried the truth alongside a body that didn't deserve its peace, and Clara, older perhaps harder now, had come to unearth it. Eleanor sat that night, with the guest book open beside her, her needle frozen mid-stitch, as the realization sank in. The secrets of the Edgewater family were clawing back to the surface, and this time, they would not be easily buried. Something was about to break, and when it did, it would not be quiet. The visitor's arrival was so unobtrusive, so deliberately gentle, that not a soul in the church suspected her presence to be anything more than the quiet grief of a distant mourner. Seated inconspicuously at the rear, shrouded in a black veil that caught the dim light like a gauze of mourning, she left without a word, yet not without leaving behind a trace, one that only Miss Marple would notice. Later, with the funeral book placed delicately before her, Miss Marple turned the pages not in search of the familiar signatures of Chipping Dean's known residents, but for anomalies, names that whispered of estrangement, of silences long kept. And there it was, Mrs. Lydia Gray. The name meant nothing to the village, yet the handwriting told another story, poised and measured, but with a final flourish in the sea that was almost theatrical, as though it had once belonged to someone who had been watched, perhaps even admired, on a stage not meant for her. Miss Marple's mind stirred. The name had not been spoken at the vicar's reception, nor had it appeared among the list of mourners. With a soft comment about how touching it was when old friends made the effort to pay their respects, she closed the book, but her thoughts remained open, drawn to the idea that the veiled woman had not merely attended, but had taken care to remain untraceable. In a village where names were as deeply rooted as the gravestones and faces aged alongside hedgerows, this Lydia Gray had no past, and that, Miss Marple knew, was rarely a sign of mourning, but often one of deliberate concealment. If the constable held the facts, it was the seamstress who held the truths whispered in satin folds. Miss Agnes Merriweather, who had measured generations for baptisms and burials, paused mid-stitch at the mention of the veiled woman. She looked up with a glint of memory, the kind that lives in the eyes rather than the mind. Familiar, she murmured, tilting her head as if listening to a ghost, though older, thinner, yes. But I remember her standing outside the Brabazon gate once, waiting in the rain, not for Leonard. She was looking for someone else, and no one let her in. The words hung there, like an unfinished hymn. Miss Marple said nothing but left soon after with the distinct impression that the mysterious guest had once belonged to this village in some painful silenced way. Some names disappear from public life, but echo in private recollections, buried not in cemeteries, but in the hush of memory. It was such a name Miss Marple now pursued, which led her to Miss Florence Bradbury, an old companion to the Brabazon family, now in her 90s and drifting between naps and perfect recollections. Over tea steeped strong and served with trembling hands, Miss Marple gently inquired about long-forgotten staff. Florence's eyes narrowed with effort, and then came the name, Alice Barnes. A pretty quiet maid, timid, always shrinking in the presence of Miss Isabel. One day she vanished without farewell. Accused of stealing a brooch, dismissed without a word, Leonard furious, overruled by Isabel's iron will. Leonard was the master, yes, Florence said softly, but it was Isabel who kept the books, and the secrets. Miss Marple pressed no further. She didn't need to. The pieces were falling into place. This was not a case of grief, it was the echo of old betrayal, a buried injustice now resurfacing in the quiet steps of a veiled woman who had once been turned away. There was no announcement of her arrival, no whispered recognition, no turning heads, just a subtle change in the air, a sudden hush that seemed to settle like dust when the veiled woman entered the church moments before the service began, gliding into the last pew with a grace too measured to be casual. Her presence was like a shadow cast before the storm, quiet, unsettling, deliberate, and though no one addressed her, some felt her nearness like a memory they couldn't quite place. She neither sang nor wept, but her gloved hands clutched an old hymn book for far longer than the others, her fingers twitching not in reverence but as though concealing something unholy within the sacred text. Miss Alden Hartley, long underestimated by the village for her quiet demeanor and gentle smile, had been watching, her mind ever alert beneath the polite veil of social small talk, and when the mourners drifted out into the fog-drenched dusk, Alden lingered in the vestry, returning what she claimed was borrowed lace. In truth, she took the very hymn book the veiled woman had held. Between the brittle pages of hymn 143, she discovered a folded scrap of yellowing paper, creased as though kept close for many years before finally being set free. The note read, in sharp, uneven script that trembled across the page, "They buried a lie, not a man." There was no name, no date, only the weight of something long suppressed, and the sense that this was not a confession but a last strike. A message meant not for closure, but for the shattering of peace. That night, the village pulsed with murmurs about the past. A name returned from the shadows, Eliza Brimley, a young maid dismissed from the manor in disgrace decades ago after the sudden disappearance of a priceless family heirloom, and an even more troubling rumor whispered behind locked doors. She had vanished without trace, no wedding, no funeral, no farewell, only silence. And now, after all this time, someone claimed she had returned, not as a ghost, but as a witness. Miss Hartley walked the path to the churchyard the next day, and paused at the grave of Master Rowan, her eyes narrowing at the earth, which had settled strangely uneven, almost as if it breathed beneath her feet. It was not fresh, yet it looked disturbed, slightly raised on one side, as if something had moved inside. And then there was the strange tale of Thomas Bell, the gravekeeper, a man of thick hands and thicker nerves who had collapsed while tending the very site days earlier, mumbling about a coldness in the earth, and a voice that wasn't his own. While most dismissed his babbling as the product of gin or heat, Miss Hartley had seen the fear in his eyes, the kind that doesn't come from dreams but from things seen in waking hours that the mind can't explain. She paid a quiet visit to Inspector Marrett, under the harmless pretense of delivering her late mother's chutney recipe, and over tea she gently remarked, "Some people faint from heat, others from fright, but sometimes, it's not what happens to them, it's what they see." Marrett, a man well acquainted with her subtle methods, didn't reply at first, but something in his expression shifted, and that evening, he stood at the edge of Rowan's grave beneath the fading sky, staring down at the crooked soil, and feeling for the first time in his career, that something truly unnatural had rooted itself there. When the formal request to exhume the grave was made, the family's response was telling: no outrage, no protest, just a cold practiced stillness from Evelyn, Rowan's widow, whose voice trembled not with grief but restraint as she said, "Let the dead rest. Disturbing graves only wakes things that should be left buried." But the decision was made, and when the coffin was unearthed beneath the dim morning light, what lay inside was not silence, but betrayal wrapped in silk. The face was wrong, familiar to no one. The clothing belonged to another generation, and beneath the collar was a locket, tarnished but unmistakably the one Eliza had been blamed for all those years ago. It wasn't just the wrong man, it was the wrong story, and as gasps echoed among the watchers, far beyond the churchyard, hidden beneath a weeping willow, where the fog ran thick and low, a veiled woman turned slowly away, her footsteps fading into the mist, not with sorrow, but with the satisfaction of truth finally rising like smoke from the ruin of lies. The night carried a suffocating stillness, the kind that whispered warnings through the trees as the ground was disturbed under a moon that seemed too pale, too watchful. The exhumation was performed not with reverence, but with an eerie swiftness, as if those present feared the very air around the grave. The inspector, clad in a long overcoat and gloves that gleamed dully in the lantern light, maintained a detached demeanor that bordered on indifference, but his eyes betrayed a restless precision, scanning every movement with the intensity of a man not looking for truth, but confirmation. The official reasons cited had been straightforward: to rule out interference after the gravedigger's strange fall, but those who gathered knew better. They had seen the gravedigger's face as he muttered about something wrong down there, eyes wild and haunted before he lost his footing near the headstone. When the coffin was unearthed and the lid creaked open with a reluctant groan, A silence fell heavy upon the group. Leonard Dorrington's body lay as it had been, undisturbed, serene, hands folded across his chest as though sleep had claimed him kindly. But beneath his right hand, almost absorbed into the fabric of the coffin's lining, was a black velvet pouch that hadn't been there before. It was the sort of detail meant to go unnoticed, small enough to be missed, significant enough to change everything. The inspector retrieved it with the delicacy of one handling a confession. When opened, two items were revealed: an old gold locket with delicate filigree etching and a plain woman's ring. Yet what marked the moment was not the objects themselves, but the initials etched inside the ring. The air changed. Edith Harrow, Leonard's niece and the inheritor of the estate, turned a shade paler, her back stiffening visibly, while Margaret, the long-serving housekeeper whose silence had always been mistaken for loyalty, let her eyes drop for the first time in decades. The inspector's question, "Do these items belong to the deceased?" was met with murmured uncertainty. Edith spoke vaguely of forgotten heirlooms, perhaps packed in haste, but even her voice sounded like it had practiced the lie too many times. Miss Marlowe, who had stood quietly at the edge of the gathering, caught every movement, every twitch of discomfort. She knew what this was. These items weren't buried out of sentimentality. They were messages, warnings, or accusations, carefully planted after death, when the corpse could no longer resist, but the secrets it took to the grave could still scream from beneath the soil. And so began the unraveling. The drawing room of the Dorrington estate, once the image of composed civility, crystal decanters, silent clocks and flower arrangements too perfectly placed to be accidental, now buzzed with something unspoken. Edith, once regal in her control, now seemed frayed at the edges. Her posture remained erect, but her hands trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup, and her responses had grown clipped, even brittle. She dismissed the discovery of the pouch with an air of forced disinterest, saying only, "Old things have a way of reappearing," but Miss Marlowe caught the way her gaze flickered to the mantelpiece, where Leonard's wedding photo had once stood, a photo now conspicuously removed. Margaret, meanwhile, had receded further into silence, her movements so cautious they felt rehearsed. Once, as she brought in the tea tray, she paused mid-step upon seeing Edith in the room, her hand hovering for a fraction too long over the porcelain. That single hesitation, so small yet so unnatural, spoke volumes. And then there was Godfrey, Leonard's only son, whose demeanor shifted from indifferent to unreachable. He seemed exhausted by something no one else could see, speaking in tones too flat to be natural, as if holding together a facade built on crumbling stone. He no longer met eyes. He no longer lingered in the drawing room. And soon he was found dead, alone, beneath the twisted branches of the orchard, the grass wet with dew, and something far darker. His death was quiet, unremarkable in its presentation, yet wrong in a way no one could articulate. The constable arrived, called by Mrs. Kendall, the neighbor's cook who had seen Godfrey's form from her upstairs window, and felt a chill that hadn't left her since. And still, no one wept. Miss Marlowe, however, did not grieve. She observed, and what she saw was not a family unraveling. It was a performance long sustained, finally failing under the weight of something buried too deep for too long. The locket, the ring, the missing photograph, the altered temperaments, and now the sudden death. These were not isolated events, but chapters of a story clawing its way to the surface. Leonard had not gone to his grave alone. He had taken secrets with him, and someone, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of vengeance, had chosen to unearth them, quite literally. The initials "me" were no coincidence. They were a name, a whisper, a threat. And now, as the household teetered on the edge of revelation, Miss Marlowe knew the dead were not finished speaking. The question was no longer what had been hidden, but who had the most to lose if the truth came roaring back from the grave. The game had begun, and this time, the living were no longer in control. The body had been found not by search or summons, but by a twist of fate. Elsie, the gardener's daughter, had wandered into the orchard, drawn by the promise of fallen apples, and instead stumbled upon death. A bottle lay beside him, its label faded, its contents unmistakably laudanum, half consumed. The doctor, fetched in hurried whispers, confirmed the inevitable with mechanical detachment. No wounds, no struggle. The word suicide crept through the village like mold through bread, slow but sure, clinging to every corner. Yet to Miss Aloan Hartley, an aging but ever perceptive observer of the human soul, this conclusion landed not as truth, but as an insult to her instinct. She had seen death in many forms, some chosen, others disguised, and what struck her now was not the absence of breath, but the absence of closure. Men who wished to die did not vanish into silence, they left behind echoes, notes, tokens, last attempts at being understood. But here, nothing. Godfrey's affairs were untouched, papers scattered like forgotten thoughts, no farewell scribbled in haste, no semblance of peace. Instead, his room held an eerie inertia, as though interrupted rather than concluded. She recalled his eyes during the funeral. There had been something brittle behind the sorrow, something afraid. Isabel, his sister, had spoken of his death with more weariness than grief, as though unburdened rather than bereaved. And always, the shadow of Alice Harrow lingered, the girl once dismissed from service under a veil of disgrace, whose initials Miss Hartley had seen delicately stitched into a handkerchief tucked within the coffin lining, unnoticed by most, but not by her. A signal, perhaps, an echo waiting to be answered. The whispers of years past called louder now, and so, with the patience that only age affords, Miss Hartley paid a visit to Mrs. Fenwick, the vicar's widow and village memory keeper, now more recluse than matron, but sharp as a tack where the past was concerned. Their conversation meandered through parish gossip and jam competitions before Miss Hartley gently introduced the name Alice. Mrs. Fenwick's mouth tightened. Sweet girl, foolish perhaps, loved too easily. Godfrey, he had charm, the dangerous sort, looked like a man of depth, but only when seen from above. There had been rumors, of course, about stolen jewelry, about a dismissal, too swift to be just. Isabel, fierce in pride, had refused to hear anything in Alice's defense. Leonard, the elder brother, had tried to intervene, but his voice, Mrs. Fenwick noted bitterly, was rarely louder than his sister's glare. Alice had vanished soon after, no letter, no destination, just absence. In that silence, Miss Hartley heard echoes, not just of shame, but of concealment. Layer by layer, she peeled the story, through old remarks, hesitations, contradictions, and what emerged was a tale, as old as tragedy itself. Godfrey had seduced Alice under the guise of affection. She, young and hopeful, believed in love. The result had not been mere heartbreak but a child, a scandal buried beneath whispers and denial. Alice had been cast out, her voice drowned by propriety, her existence edited from the Brabazon legacy. And now, after years of curated silence, Godfrey had followed her, not by guilt's design alone, but by fear. Someone had reminded him, someone had let him know the past was not done. Miss Hartley saw now that the bottle of laudanum had not promised escape but protection from revelation. And in that realization the air around the village seemed to shift. What had begun as a tragic end now whispered of something deeper, a reckoning in motion and perhaps still unfinished. The child had not merely been born in silence, she had been hidden, her very existence stitched into the dark seams of a house that valued appearance above truth. It was not discretion that sealed her away but a cold, calculated decision made behind velvet curtains and iron doors. Gregory Harwood, the once formidable patriarch whose mind had begun to fade like old ink on parchment, had not learned of the child through confession or family gossip, but from the haunted glances of Helena Miles, the governess whose sudden dismissal had once passed with barely a raised eyebrow. Something about the way she walked away from the estate, not with rage but with a heart shattered under the weight of unspoken betrayal, had lingered in Gregory's failing memory like a bruise that never quite faded. A close confidant of the family, now aged and forgotten herself, recalled how Gregory, upon learning the hidden truth, had tried to act, not publicly, but quietly, with the restraint of a man torn between duty and guilt. He arranged support, subtle financial aid, perhaps a private letter, perhaps more, but his intentions were smothered at their inception by Cassandra Harwood, his niece, whose influence grew with every slow step of Gregory's decline. Cassandra did not scream or curse or storm, she erased. Helena was not dismissed, she was eliminated from the narrative. Her letters intercepted, her name scratched from ledgers, her belongings donated or burned, as if she had never drawn breath beneath the same roof. What Gregory tried to preserve in secret was undone with surgical cruelty by a woman whose obsession with order was rooted not in propriety, but in a kind of primal fear, fear of exposure, fear of fracture, fear that the tight knot of legacy would unravel if a single hidden thread were pulled. But Elspeth Wren, a woman underestimated most of her life, a retired schoolmistress whose gaze saw beneath masks, felt that fear instantly when she returned to the estate as a guest of the new owners. Something was off, not merely in the absences but in the effort with which those absences were maintained. Helena's name was never spoken, not even by accident. A photograph once displayed on the mantel was now missing, and a replacement frame held a new image, awkwardly sized. And then in the vicarage, tucked between hymnals and yellowing books, Elspeth spotted a cropped photograph from decades ago. The image, once whole, was now surgically shortened. The left edge cut with mechanical precision, just enough to erase a figure. Elspeth's breath had caught, not because of what was shown, but because of what was no longer permitted to be. Photographs, she knew, did not lie, but those who curated them did. She began to ask questions gently, never directly, but always watching. A chance conversation with Gregory's former solicitor, veiled beneath a fabricated inquiry into charitable endowments, revealed that the original portrait, once assumed destroyed, had been stored carefully in Gregory's private study. With the quiet help of a long-retired secretary who still held loyalty in her bones, Elspeth managed to glimpse the uncut canvas. And there she was, Helena, her eyes soft, her expression guarded, standing just at the edge, almost as though she knew she'd one day be removed. The image confirmed what Elspeth already suspected. Gregory, weakened and worn, had still tried to preserve the truth in some quiet way, perhaps knowing he would not be able to fight Cassandra directly. But what chilled Elspeth further came not from paintings or whispers, but from the mouth of a young, unassuming assistant at the local chemist. Talkative and unaware of consequence, he mentioned that Miss Cassandra Harwood had recently requested a precise dosage of atropine, a toxin rarely used outside of specialized medical cases. When questioned, she had explained it was to deal with rodents in the wine cellar. The dosage, the assistant said, was measured exactly, not too little, not enough to attract suspicion. Elspeth said nothing, but in that moment she understood, the removal of Helena had not been enough. The threat lingered, not in the form of a scandal, but in the form of a bloodline. Then came the final unraveling, in a concealed drawer within Gregory's writing desk, behind a false panel no one thought to check. Elspeth discovered a sealed envelope, labeled only, "In the event of my absence." Inside, folded neatly, was a revised copy of his will, unsigned, yet initialed, and a letter. The words struck like thunder. Gregory had intended to leave the estate, not to Cassandra, nor to any other family member, but to Clara Winthrop, born Clara Helena, the daughter of Helena Miles, formerly in his employ. The revelation was not just scandalous, it was the veiled woman seen weeping at Gregory's funeral, the one who left a white rose and vanished before anyone could ask her name, had not come merely to mourn, she had come as heir. And if Cassandra had suspected this, if she had even feared it, then nothing that followed had been coincidence. Gregory's sudden illness, the hush paid to former staff, the destroyed letters, the staged silences, they were not reactions, they were preemptive strikes. The poison was not given in haste, but in calculation. This was not madness. This was control, control threatened, unraveling, and finally, killing. Elspeth Wren folded the letter back into its envelope, with trembling hands. The house, for all its polish and grandeur, had become a mausoleum of buried truths. But now, the dead were speaking, and Elspeth had learned how to listen. Miss Edith Blackwell closed the cracked leather-bound journal with a slow, almost reverent touch, her eyes lingering not on the final words inked by a trembling hand, but on the weight of what had remained unspoken, a weight that still hung in the air like the scent of old lavender and mothballs. In the quiet confines of her drawing room, where the fire whispered and shadows danced gently against time-worn wallpaper, Edith knew the truth had never been about legal closure or the brittle authority of ink-stamped justice. It was something older, something buried beneath decades of silence, half-truths, and carefully edited histories. What the late Archibald Langford had failed to confront in his lifetime, he had tried, far too subtly, far too late, to whisper into the world through coded footnotes and a single torn letter hidden behind a false panel in his study. It wasn't enough. And now others, faster, colder, with clearer motives, had stepped forward to shape the narrative in their own image. Yet Edith, no stranger to secrets and the soft echoes of hidden sorrows, understood that truth often bloomed not through confrontation, but through gentleness, like a reluctant bud opening at the soft coaxing of morning light. That is why she invited Eleanor Carrington, not under the guise of suspicion, but with the tender offer of shared tea, of quiet companionship, of a silence made sacred. Eleanor arrived precisely on time, her demeanor that of a woman armored by decades of restraint, her posture straight, voice even, eyes unreadable. The gloves came off eventually, and as steam rose in delicate tendrils from bone china cups, Edith wove the conversation carefully from roses to recipes to rain. And then without warning, she let the name slip, Clara Hastings. There was a pause, brief but unmistakable. Eleanor's hand hesitated, her teaspoon stilled mid-stir, and a shadow passed across her composed expression. When she finally spoke, it wasn't with theatrics or trembling confessions, but with the raw simplicity of someone finally loosening a bandaged wound. "She was my sister," she said. "Not biologically perhaps, but in every way that mattered, raised under the same roof until shame and secrecy tore them apart." Eleanor had spent her life navigating the silent repercussions of Clara's disappearance, whispers in the hallways, omissions in family photographs, the echo of a name never spoken aloud. She had come to Greystone not to dig up the past, but to bury it properly, to leave behind a truth no one else had dared to claim. The letter she had placed in the folds of Archibald's funeral shroud had been a farewell, not an accusation, but a reconciliation, a final attempt to honor the girl who had once braided her hair and cried on her shoulder. "I'm sorry I stayed silent," the note had read. "You deserved more." And as she spoke, her voice never rose, her hands never trembled, but the grief in her words was thick with years and heavy with what had never been said. Edith listened, not as interrogator, but as keeper of a sacred flame. And when the story ended, she simply refilled the cup and allowed the hush between them to hold everything that could not be spoken aloud. What others might misread as guilt or blame, she now saw clearly as the echo of love, twisted by time and silence into something almost unrecognizable. Yet Edith also sensed, subtly, unmistakably, that someone else had found that letter first, someone who had chosen to twist its meaning for their own ends. The real danger, she realized, wasn't in what had been said, but in what someone believed had been said. And that realization, quiet and sharp as a hairline crack in fine porcelain, meant the story was far from over. The mid-morning light filtered through the ivy-laced windows of Ashcroft Hall, casting long golden shards across the worn tapestry rug, as if the sun itself hesitated to enter a house so steeped in unspoken history. Eleanor Redwick stood at the threshold of the drawing room, no announcement, no fanfare, just a woman with a tired coat, dust clinging to its hem, and eyes that had clearly weathered a lifetime of looking in from the outside. She was not expected, certainly not welcomed by all, and yet her presence carried with it a strange inevitability, as though fate had long marked this moment. When the amended will of Henry Redwick was unveiled, naming Eleanor, an unacknowledged daughter, as sole heir, there was no dramatic outcry, only a deep and suffocating stillness that spread through the house like creeping fog. Eleanor, for her part, showed no sign of triumph or claim, only confusion laced with disbelief, as if she couldn't reconcile the idea that a man who had existed in her life only as an absence would now leave her his legacy. "He remembered us?" she asked softly, the words brittle with emotion, her voice barely rising above the delicate clink of porcelain as tea cooled untouched beside her. "Miss Alderton," An observant guest known in village circles for her uncanny perception, noticed everything. The way Eleanor's fingers trembled when she tucked the will back into its envelope, how she avoided everyone's eyes, except the portrait of Henry above the hearth, whose gaze seemed to accuse even in oil and frame. But what truly drew Miss Alderton's concern were the others. Margot Redwick, Henry's sister, ever composed and clad in charcoal grey, whose smiles now flickered like a candle in the draught. Ruth, the long-time maid once bustling and bright, now moving through rooms like a ghost burdened by secrets. And Thomas Meridew, the family solicitor, whose insistence that the matter is quite settled, seemed oddly hasty for a man known for meticulous caution. There were signs everywhere, subtle yet telling, a faded photograph of Henry, and a young woman with Eleanor's eyes, hidden behind a drawer of old guest records, a journal page torn out, its ink smudged as though someone had thought better of letting certain truths remain in writing. Miss Alderton requested access to Henry's study, using the harmless excuse of retrieving a borrowed gardening book, and beneath a false bottom in the old oak desk, she discovered what she had quietly hoped for, a yellowed envelope, sealed with brittle wax and marked in Henry's unmistakable hand, "To the one I never had the courage to name." She did not open it, not yet, for the truth it held needed the right moment, one in which silence could no longer shield guilt. That evening, as twilight crawled across the grounds and the garden's shadows grew long, Miss Alderton arranged a quiet gathering in the drawing-room. Margot, Ruth, Thomas and Eleanor, all invited under the pretense of simple tea. The air was heavy with civility, strained under the weight of glances too careful and words too polished. Miss Alderton began with polite talk, daffodils blooming early, village gossip, the shifting weather, but once the cups were full and spoons laid to rest, she placed the unopened envelope gently on the table. No one spoke at first. Eleanor's eyes locked on the letter, breath caught somewhere between fear and longing. Margot's hands clenched around her teacup, the knuckles white. Ruth's lower lip trembled. Thomas cleared his throat and looked down, as if hoping to vanish into the carpet. Still no accusations were made. There were no raised voices or pointing fingers, only the unbearable stillness that follows when the dead finally begin to speak through the things they left behind. Eleanor didn't reach for the envelope. She only stared, as though the weight of a life's worth of silence pressed down upon her chest, while everyone else silently questioned just how much Henry had truly hidden behind the walls of this house. And Miss Alderton, watching them all, understood that this had never been about inheritance or names, but about what people were willing to hide to protect a version of the past that suited them. Someone here had known, perhaps all of them, and in that knowledge, they had chosen complicity. They had buried the truth not to protect Eleanor, but to preserve themselves. Now with the letter before them, that carefully managed history had begun to unravel. What it contained could shift everything, not through drama, but through revelation. As the clock ticked on, its chimes cold and measured, Miss Alderton knew one thing with certainty. The final act of this story was not in the inheritance, but in the fear of the truth it revealed. And that truth, quietly waiting in paper and ink, was about to demand to be heard. As the suffocating silence hung in the air like a shroud, broken only by the faint rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corridor, the mere utterance of Anna Braithwaite's name seemed to drain all color from the room, freezing every breath, every twitch, every unspoken word into something heavy and fragile. Eleanor Hartwell, the once imposing matriarch of Highmere Hall, whose shadow stretched long across generations, did not flinch, but the grip she kept on her teacup had turned her knuckles bloodless, and her lips were drawn so tightly together, it seemed she was holding back, not words but a scream. Around her the others sat in a strange paralysis. Mrs. Vale looked pale and visibly shaken, her fingers absently tracing a worn thread on the armrest of her chair, while Charles, the ever-arrogant heir apparent, shifted uncomfortably, the mask of superiority beginning to crack at its edges. It was Miss Farnsworth, unassuming in presence but piercing in perception, who finally shattered the silence with a voice so calm, so steady, that it chilled more than it soothed. "What we were led to believe about Henry Ashcombe's death," she began, "was a fiction delicately arranged, a narrative constructed not from truth but fear." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle like dust. then drew from her coat a single folded sheet yellowed with age but still sharp in meaning. This is the will Henry amended days before his death, hidden away, unfinished but undeniably intentional. And it does not name Charles. It names Anna. A collective breath was held, not released, as if the room itself resisted this new reality. Henry sought to atone. Miss Farnsworth continued, her voice now barely above a whisper. For Ruth, for the daughter cast aside. Not with public declarations but with a gesture of quiet reparation. He left everything to Anna. She turned to Eleanor, whose expression remained still, but whose eyes shimmered with the fury of a storm barely restrained. And Eleanor, Miss Farnsworth added, you found it, you read every word, and in that moment the truth became your enemy. The inspector, silent until now, leaned forward from his shadowed corner, his voice low and cold. And Peter? Miss Farnsworth's eyes darkened. Peter was clever. He watched, listened, connected dots others ignored. Perhaps he saw the locket Ruth gave Anna. Perhaps he overheard Eleanor's confrontation with Charles in the study. Or worse, he saw the will. Her gaze locked on Eleanor. You couldn't risk that. The method had been subtle. A precise dose of aconite, disguised in Peter's nightly tonic, too smooth to be detected, too small to be suspected, yet enough to still a healthy heart in its sleep. You see, Miss Farnsworth said softly, this wasn't murder born of malice, it was born of dread. The dread of losing control over a story so carefully spun. Of losing power. Of being seen, truly seen. Eleanor's fingers twitched, and the teacup gently rattled against its saucer like a final gasp of protest. And the note in Henry's coffin, Miss Farnsworth added, her voice gentler now, was not a threat. It was a message from Anna to Ruth, a final act of love from a daughter to the mother she never knew, tucked quietly into the coffin in the only place grief could speak without interruption. But Eleanor saw those initials, A.B., and in her guilt and terror, she misread them. She saw accusation where there was only sorrow, and her fear turned fatal. The atmosphere thickened as the truth laid its cold fingers on every soul in the room. Anna, seated by the window, remained silent, her face serene, but her eyes glistening with the weight of generations, and a single tear, unmoving on her cheek, bore more truth than 100 words could. And then, in the far corner, Mrs. Vale, breath hitching and shoulders trembling, finally broke. I saw her. That night. Eleanor, in the dark, entering Henry's study with something clenched in her hand. Her voice cracked. And I knew, something terrible had begun. In that moment, with the lies undone, and the house echoing with truths it had long tried to forget, the grand halls of Highmere felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. One built not with stone, but with secrets. In the days that led to Edmund Halbert's death, the old estate seemed to hold its breath, as if the very walls had grown weary of the secrets they'd long concealed. Echoes of raised voices had been heard behind the velvet-lined doors of the study, muffled yet unmistakable, sharp with tension and broken by abrupt silences. And though Eleanor Brant had sensed something dark festering beneath the surface, dread had wrapped around her throat like ivy, making it impossible to speak. Now, seated stiffly in the drawing room, where the heavy scent of old wood and faded roses lingered like a ghost, Miss Halbert clasped her hands in her lap, and whispered with a calmness that chilled more than it soothed. There is no justice, only revelation, often too late. And as the wind stirred the garden outside, rattling the frost-bitten branches like skeletal fingers, she reflected, not on a single dramatic discovery, but on the slow, quiet crawl of truth that crept in like mist, unnoticed until it consumed the whole landscape. It had been an accumulation of details, each trivial on its own, but together damning. An old photograph, once torn in rage, but later found lovingly restored and hidden behind a drawer's false back. A scent of violet perfume that Helena claimed she hadn't worn in years. And yet it clung faintly to the handle of the locked cabinet, where rare tinctures were kept. Michael, the groundskeeper with the worn eyes and shaking hands, had grown visibly tense the moment Miranda appeared after years away. His glances evasive, his words halting when asked about the greenhouse that stood unused for a decade. Until recently, when fresh footprints had been found in its dusty soil. Then, there was the letter opener, always polished and placed neatly beside Edmund's correspondence, now found lying askew with a speck of something, not quite ink, drying near its blade, and the key to the study, which had not hung from its hook for several days leading up to the incident. Despite Helena's insistence that no one had entered without Edmund's consent, these were not coincidences. Miss Halbert had realized, but fractures in a carefully constructed lie, and when she voiced her observations, they formed a line not of accusation, but undeniable logic, leading to the one person whose silence had been more eloquent than any confession. Helena Ashcroft, poised as ever, whose fingers now trembled visibly in her lap. The room fell into a heavy, breathless silence, and then Helena stood, not in panic or protest, but with the quiet resignation of someone who had fought for too long to uphold an illusion, and now saw no further use in struggle. "I did what I had to," she said, her voice stripped of emotion, her eyes not meeting anyone's but rather fixed somewhere distant, as though gazing back through time, to the moment she first made her choice. "You cannot allow the weight of sentiment to tear down what you've spent a lifetime building." And in that single statement was not regret, but exhaustion, the weary surrender of someone whose walls had finally cracked. "I knew who she was the moment I saw her," she continued, referring to Miranda, "and I knew what her presence would unearth. Edmund's guilt, the child he tried to forget, the fortune bound by a lie we buried together." And at those words, Michael looked down, tears filling his tired eyes, while Miranda's face remained unreadable, pale as marble, as though frozen between rage and grief. Inspector Havisham, who had listened in solemn stillness, finally stepped forward and with the gravity of finality, "Lady Helena Ashcroft, you'll need to come with us," and though she turned to him with a flicker of defiance, it gave way to something softer, almost relief, as she nodded and allowed herself to be led away, her heels clicking on the marble like the toll of a distant bell. Miss Halbert did not speak, not for a long while, and when she finally did glance at the now empty chair where Helena had sat so regally just moments before, there was no triumph in her gaze, only the hollow ache of someone who had uncovered the truth, but found no comfort in it. For justice, when it arrives, rarely feels like victory. It comes limping, bruised, dragging behind it the pieces of what has already been lost. And in the weeks that followed, as Helena's arrest spiraled into chaos, wills contested, accounts frozen, the estate's proud legacy, unraveling in courts and quiet arguments, Miranda remained curiously still, untouched by the legal storm, as though she had known all along that the reckoning would come, and had spent years preparing to meet it, not with fury, but with silence. Miss Elowen Hartley had returned not with triumph, but with the still resolve of someone who had lived too long beneath the weight of unanswered questions and unspoken grief. When news of Ambrose Hartley's death, her estranged father and the enigmatic master of the crumbling Hawthorne estate echoed through the parish, it stirred more than gossip. It awakened old suspicions, memories long buried, and the chill of unfinished stories. Some expected her to stake a claim, to stride into the decaying manor, and demand what bloodline entitled her to. But Elowen moved like a shadow through the village, neither demanding nor defending, simply observing with a gaze that saw through facades. When the family solicitor, flustered and awkward, reached out with trembling hands and an envelope sealed in old wax, she declined even to open it. "This place was never built for me," she said with calm finality, "and I will not inherit its ghosts. The estate as written in Ambrose's last will, passed to a cousin of no repute, a man who had never set foot on Hartley soil, and likely never would." Some called her noble, others whispered that secrets tied her tongue. But Elowen cared little for the opinions of those who never knew what it meant to be erased. She had returned not for the house, nor the name, but for a grave that had never been marked, her mother's, hidden beneath a copse of birch trees at the edge of the woods, a woman silenced by scandal, and buried without ceremony under the veil of shame. With quiet determination and funds she had scraped together over years, she petitioned the council, and after weeks of resistance and wary glances, was permitted to place a simple stone. No flourishes, no heritage claims, just Rosamond Vale, a mother, remembered. No one else attended the blessing. Only Miss Adeline Moore stood at a respectful distance, her gloved hands folded, watching the ritual unfold not as a spectacle, but as a silent defiance of the lies history tried to preserve. There were no flowers, no wails, only Eloan kneeling before the freshly laid stone, the wind carrying the scent of moss and old secrets, her stillness louder than grief. Back in her ivy-wrapped cottage, Miss Moore resumed her quiet habits, polishing old porcelain, watering tired herbs, dusting the spines of books filled with forgotten truths. Yet her thoughts drifted often to what had been unearthed, for beneath every legacy lay a tapestry of shame, denial, and stories rewritten to suit comfort. She thought of Ambrose, a man who had carved silence into every room of that house, who in his final days had tried, however weakly, to make amends with letters never sent and wills never spoken of aloud. His remorse had come like winter's sun, too pale, too late. And she thought of the cruelty that often came dressed as order, of how the pursuit of reputation had buried not only a woman, but her entire memory. Eloan had not come to reclaim a family, but to resurrect a truth, and in doing so had shattered the myth that silence protects. Justice, Miss Moore knew, was rarely theatrical. It arrived in moments like this, in the return of a name to the earth, in the stillness of a daughter, refusing to let shame dictate memory, in the quiet resistance to a legacy built on omission. And so, on a golden morning, where April light filtered through lace curtains and the scent of lavender drifted through the open pane, Miss Moore sat by her window, a cup cooling in her hand, and let her thoughts settle like dust in old corners. The story had ended not with applause or verdict, but with a woman walking away from wealth to reclaim something far greater, her mother's place in the world. It wasn't justice in the eyes of the law, but it was something older, quieter, deeper, the kind that lingers in the soil, that roots itself into stone, and that whispers through generations until someone, finally, listens.
Hey.
The oil lamp on the windowsill flickered with a strange hesitation, as if uncertain whether to ward off the encroaching dark or surrender to it. And just beyond the fogged pane, a blackbird perched on a skeletal branch, its feathers dusted with frost, and its gaze unsettlingly steady, as though it had returned not out of instinct, but obligation. Inside, Miss Verena Quinn sat in the high-backed chair she had claimed since girlhood, her needles stilled mid-air, the half-knit scarf slipping from her lap like the breath of someone who had just remembered something they spent years trying to forget. The room around her was saturated in the quiet echoes of time, the tick of a reluctant clock, the sigh of old floorboards, the whisper of wind brushing against lace curtains as though trying to speak. Above the hearth hung that haunting portrait, Clara Dunn at 16, her face delicate, mouth curved in a smile too obedient to be real, and eyes that seemed to look beyond the canvas, towards some future she had never reached. That winter of 1928 had swallowed her without warning, the river overflowing with snowmelt and unspoken things, and the town had nodded and mourned and moved on, grateful for the simplicity of an accident, unwilling to entertain the complications of a truth more terrible. But Verena had known, even as a child, she had known, that silence had been chosen like a garment by those who couldn't bear the chill of reality. Now, nearly a century later, a knock at the door had shattered that carefully preserved quiet. It wasn't loud, but it was final, the kind of sound that insists on being answered. Standing there had been a woman in grey, her coat damp from rain, her face bone pale, but burning with a purpose time could not dull. "I'm Frances Dunn," she'd said, the name heavy in the air like incense in a sealed room. From that moment, the air inside the house had changed, no longer stale, but charged, as though memory itself had begun to shift in its sleep. What followed wasn't dramatic, it was precise, painful, and necessary. They didn't speak in accusations or sobs, but in slow, careful truths of Clara's bruises, always explained away with practiced smiles, of the nights she was sent to the cellar alone, of the man whose charm cloaked rot like perfume on spoiled fruit, of the women who looked away because looking too closely would mean admitting they knew. Verena listened, then spoke, then wept, quietly, as though afraid the walls might still be listening. And somewhere between dusk and dawn, something unraveled, something old and stubborn and cruel. Frances didn't want revenge. She wanted a name to be said again without shame. She wanted a stone carved with truth, not euphemism. She wanted her mother back, not alive, but known. When she left, she didn't look back, but the house felt different, as though the ghosts had shifted, unburdened, perhaps even appeased. Outside, the blackbird flew off into the growing dusk, its wings slicing through the air like a page turning in a long-closed book. Verena, left alone once more, whispered to the room, and perhaps to Clara herself, "I'm sorry it took this long." No one answered, but the warmth that returned to the fire didn't feel like coincidence. And so, not with scandal or vengeance, but with remembrance and release, the story of Clara Dunn returned from the hush of forgotten corners to the place it had always belonged, in the open, in the light, in the hearts of those ready to remember. In the end, it was not fury, nor force, but the quiet insistence of truth, the kind that waits, watches, and refuses to die, that brought justice to a girl the world tried to forget.